Hello and welcome to the Rookie Reader. I am Jennifer. So it is time to share with you my favorite books that I read in the year 2023. So to start with, this was my first year really reading books for fun. So I set my goal to read 12 books this year, and my thought was I'll read one book per month. I thought that was pretty good, pretty lofty goal for a new hobby. I ended up reading 49 books this year, which is just crazy to me. And I'm going to share with you the best 10 out of those 49 books that I read. So as far as the genres go, if you were to ask me what my favorite genre was, I would say mystery thriller. But when according to like the books that I read that are my favorites, that's not the case. So two of the books that I am going to share with you are contemporary fiction. One is romantasy, one is a horror book, 4 are historical fiction, which is shocking to me. I would never have said like, oh, my favorite genre is historical fiction. And 2 are mystery thrillers. Okay, so in no particular order, the first book on this list is Yellowface by R.F. Kuang. Okay, so this is the story of 2 writers. There's Athena, who is a successful writer, and there is June, who is not a successful writer. They actually went to college together and they graduated at the same time, and Athena's career took off and June's career really went nowhere. They continued to stay friends, or more like frenemies. They didn't seem to really like each other, but they hung out together sometimes. And one evening when they were hanging out together, Athena, the successful writer, unexpectedly passes away. And when that happens, June takes advantage of the situation and steals Athena's latest manuscript, which hasn't been published yet, and she publishes it as her own. So in addition to stealing this manuscript, she also ends up changing her name from June Hayward to her full name Juniper and her middle name Song. So her new name is Juniper Song, and that's what she's going to publish the book under. So she goes from being Caucasian to ambiguously perhaps Asian. And the manuscript she's stolen has an Asian history to it. And so this book does touch on those subjects of cultural appropriation, racism, diversity, and touches on all that, and it does it in such a cool way. Like, it was such a fun read. It's contemporary fiction, but there's definitely some mystery thriller elements to it, which I think is why I liked it so much. But definitely, I didn't think I was gonna like this book at all when I first picked it up, and I ended up loving it. I gave it 5 stars. It's one of my favorite, it's one of my top 10 favorite books this year. Okay, so the next book on the list is Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros. This is another book that I didn't think I was going to like. Everyone was talking about it, and I'm like, I don't like fantasy. I don't think I like fantasy. I've never really given fantasy a fair shot, I should say. This is my first experience doing that. And I actually read both of the books that came out this year. So the first book that she wrote was called Fourth Wing, and the second one was called Iron Flame. Fourth Wing, I loved. It's a 5-star book for me, and I'll explain why in just a minute, but the second book did not love, and I'll explain why as well. So in the book Fourth Wing, we're following a 20-year-old Violet Sorengale who has gone into this dragon training school, basically. She was supposed to become a scribe, which is kind of like, from what I can tell, like a librarian kind of situation. Like, they handle the books and the histories. That's what she was supposed to do. But her mom, who's like the general of this whole army, made her go into the dragon riding quadrant and study there. The thing is it's extremely dangerous, and Violet sees herself, and I think she's like petite and weak, and she has to fight really hard just to stay alive. And what I liked about the book is I loved the whole like academic part of it, like they're in a school training situation, but it's incredibly dangerous. People around her are constantly dying. There's a lot of death in the book. Like, they're dying to even get to the school to start with. They're dying during their trainings. Like, people around her are constantly dying. And so there's a constant threat of like trying to stay alive. And then in addition to that, there are people who are enemies of her mother who might want to kill her in the school. So it's very interesting. And then there's a very heated love story that happens, and it's like enemies to lovers kind of situation that goes on, which is why I think it's called a romantasy. And it's definitely a very spicy book. Now I can't speak to a lot of that because I was listening to it on audio and my kids were home. So anytime I got to a spicy section, I was just like fast forwarding to get through it. So I can't speak to if that part was any good or not. But the storyline itself, I found very engaging, very interesting. When I finished the book, I couldn't wait to read the second book. And even though I didn't enjoy the second book, if she comes out with a third, I'll read that one too. But the reason why I didn't like the second book is because they leave the school and they're more into the rest of the world, and like the war and the fighting part. And I liked the whole school element, training element of it. And it is about dragons, it is about magic. And I felt like in the school environment, the reason why I don't like fantasy books normally is it's hard for me to picture these worlds that the authors are trying to build. And in the school environment, I found it very easy to build that world in my head. And once they left the school and it was a much bigger fantasy world, it was harder for me to picture it. But the book that I loved, The Fourth Wing, was a 5-star book for this year. Okay, so the next book on my list is Holly by Stephen King. So this is only my second Stephen King novel. I read Fairy Tale by him last year and I liked part of the book and part of the book I didn't like, but I loved his writing. So when he came out with a new book this year, I was really excited to get it and read it just because I enjoy the way he writes. I enjoy being immersed into his writing and his stories because of his writing. And this book was excellent. I loved it. I loved the character Holly. And I guess she was a minor character in other books that he's written, but I haven't read any of those. So this is my first experience with her. She is autistic, so she deals with people differently. She sees the world differently than I do. And I just appreciated that and seeing her point of view. And I appreciated the way she saw things. And it's like a murder mystery kind of thing, but we know it's happening the whole time as the audience. We know who the murderers are, and from the very beginning. So it's about, the thing is this is the only horror book that I have on my top 10 this year. I did read other horror books this year and they kind of like, I'm not sure if I'm a fan of horror. This is the only 5-star horror book I read. And even this book, there were parts where, sorry, I'm just thinking about it now, like I literally wanted to throw up. Like it made me physically ill. So those parts were difficult. And sometimes I just had to skip those parts because I was not doing well. So the story takes place during COVID and Holly is a detective. Her mom has just passed away from COVID. Her business partner is sick with COVID and she takes this case hesitantly because of the whole world being in the situation that it is. She hesitantly takes this case from a mom. A mom calls her daughter's missing, she is worried. So Holly is looking for this girl. And then as she is doing this, she discovers, oh, there's a bunch of missing people from this town, this city, especially like the specific part of the city. And like, she has to figure out if they're connected and how they're connected and all of that. So it's good. I really liked it. It was fun. Okay, so the next book on my list is Lessons in Chemistry by Bonnie Garmus. Now, I'm not ranking these books from like least favorite to favorite, but if I were, this would be number 1. I can tell you this is my absolute number 1 favorite book of the year. I loved this book so much. It's so funny. It was another book I didn't want to read. I didn't think I would like. So far, 3 books I was like, I don't know if I want to read those. That being Yellowface, Fourth Wing, and now Lessons in Chemistry. Those were all books where I was like, they didn't sound good to me when I first heard about them, but I love this book so much. And I know that it has been made into a TV series on Apple Plus TV, I think, which I don't have, but I am planning on watching that series this spring. I told both of my parents to read this book and then they're gonna be visiting me in the spring and then I'm gonna get Apple TV and we're gonna watch it like all together. I think that will be really fun. We've done that a couple of times with a couple of other books. So the story of Lessons in Chemistry, it's a book about a chemist named Elizabeth Zott, and this takes place in the 1960s, and so it's a historical fiction. So she's dealing with a lot of sexism in the workplace, and then she ends up meeting and falling in love with another chemist. And while that's part of the book, it's definitely not the whole book, because she does find herself in a situation as a single mom after her romance. I won't tell you everything that happens, but she becomes a single mom. She loses her job, and she ends up a host of a cooking show. She does enjoy cooking, but that was never her dream, to be a host of a cooking show. So she takes a chemistry approach to it and teaches cooking through chemistry, and it makes her unique and it makes her very successful. So for me, it really hit home. I mean, I didn't grow up in the 60s. I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and I entered the workforce in the 90s. And there was still, I feel like, a lot of sexism at that time. And I feel like I could relate to a lot of the things that she went through. This book, it's hard to explain why, because I didn't grow up in the 1960s and I didn't have to face the kind of sexism that she had to deal with, but I felt very connected to this story, and I felt like I really understood what she was going through. And it was also presented, even though there was like hard things happening, I felt like it was presented in a pretty fun way. So I would highly recommend this book. Okay, so the next book on my list was Mad Honey by Jodi Picoult. I think that's how you say her name. I had to like look it up how to say her name, and I think it was Picoult, but I can't remember exactly. Anywho, the point is Mad Honey by Jodi. Okay, so this is the story. This is a kind of book where part of the book takes place in a courtroom, and I love those kind of books. Like I loved Where the Crawdads Sing, where it takes place in a courtroom, and I loved To Kill a Mockingbird. Those are a couple of my favorite like books from the past. So Mad Honey is the story of a woman who runs a bee farm, and I think that's where you get the honey part from. And her son, who is a teenager, but just like finished high school, so an adult, so he's like 18, he just turned 18, is accused of killing his girlfriend. And there's some huge twists along the way. And like I said, it's a courtroom, there's a big courtroom drama parts to it, and it is so good. Like I had no idea where it was going, which is why I'm being kind of vague here. I don't want to give too much away in case you want to read it. I want everything to be as surprising to you as it was to me. But so many good twists and turns, kind of changed my view about the world a little bit. So my camera overheated and I can't remember exactly what I was saying, but what I wanted to let you know about the book Mad Honey is that I feel like it changed me personally in a better way. Like I feel like I'm a better person after reading that book. I feel like I have more empathy for others and what they're going through, and it was excellent. Okay, so the next book on my list is Black Cake by Charmaine Wilkerson. This story, I think about it constantly, even though I read it several months ago now. It is the story of a woman who passes away, and when she passes away, she leaves a recording to her children, her two children, to let them know like what happened in her life, like her life story, because they only know a part of it. They don't know the whole story. So she is originally from Jamaica, and she ends up having to leave Jamaica. She fakes her own death and leaves Jamaica and moves to England. And she does this because she is accused of murder. And throughout the book, that's one of the mysteries. You're trying to find out, did she actually murder somebody? Like, what's the whole story there? And then she moves to England, and she has a crazy life in England. Eventually, she ends up in California, married, has 2 kids, and ends up having a wonderful life at the end. But everything leading up to that point is just crazy. Her life is a crazy adventure, and she shares that story with her kids, and that's what we get to hear through the book. And it is one of those beautifully written stories where there's pain and joy and so much goodness. I love the book, gave it 5 stars. It's a historical fiction, and I would highly recommend this book to anybody. So the next book on my list is Carrie, Soto is Back by Taylor Jenkins Reid. So I was introduced to Taylor Jenkins Reid this year, and I actually read several of her books. I read The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, Malibu Rising, and Daisy Jones and the Six. and this is the only one that made it to my top 10 list. I think it's an unpopular opinion. I think people really love like some of her other books more than this, but this was my favorite book. I loved it. It's the story of a tennis player who is past her prime. She was injured. She is no longer playing tennis. It's been several years since she played tennis, but in her day, she was like the top of the world. You know, she was the best at everything. And the story takes place a few years after her injury, and her like one of her world records is about to be beaten, and she decides to get back into the game to keep her world record. So and her dad is her coach. So it's this story of her trying to accomplish this really amazing goal, feat to get back in and defend her record. And it's the story of her relationship with her dad, and it's her history, and it is so good. I absolutely loved it. So the next book on the list is a book that I never hear anybody talk about, but it's called The Four Winds by Krisitn Hannah, and I actually read 2 of Krisitn Hannah's books this year. Again, this is my first experience being introduced to her, so I read this one, and I also read The Nightingale, and this one made my top 10 because it's one of those books where like I feel like I learned a lot. It was incredibly engaging and fascinating, and I loved the characters, and I think about it. I go back, like as my life is moving forward, I think back on this book. So the story of the book, we're following a woman named Eliza Martinelli, and it starts out with, in the 1920s, she is living a very like nice life with her wealthy family. She ends up marrying a poor Italian farmer, and ends up working on the farm, which is not an easy life, but she loves it. And then the Dust Bowl happens, and their farm is no longer a safe place for her and her kids, and she ends up taking her kids to California for a better life. And it is definitely not a better life when she gets to California. They go through so much suffering and pain, and you're probably thinking, why do you want to read this book like about suffering and pain? But just from a historical viewpoint, like reading like what they went through and what they experienced. And of course I've heard about the Dust Bowl and I've heard about the Great Depression, but this book really brought that situation to life, and like what life was like for an individual family, and it was fascinating, and I really loved this book. Okay, moving on to the next book, The Housemaid by Freida McFadden. This was the first Freida McFadden book that I ever read. Loved it, 5 stars. I read the second book when it came out, The Housemaid's Secret, which actually won Best Mystery Thriller of this year, 2023. I disagree with that. I made a whole video where I talk about that. I disagree with that. I don't think it should have won the whole year, but this one, the first one, The Housemaid's Secret, The Housemaid, 5 stars. Loved it. I thought it was an excellent story, great adventure. I was engaged. I think I finished it in one day, like less than one day. I just sat down and like read the whole thing. I couldn't get enough. So this is a story of a housemaid. She's kind of in a tough situation where she has just been released from prison. We don't know what she's done. For most of the book, we don't know. You find out. But she's been released from prison. She's having a hard time finding a job. She finally finds a job as a housekeeper for this wealthy family, and the wife seems totally crazy and like is making her job very difficult. And I don't want to give away too much because it's a mystery thriller, but there's just so many like twists and turns, and is so good. I absolutely loved it. If you're into mystery thrillers, I would highly recommend this book. The characters, like there's nobody like, oh, I really like this character. I think it's a good character and I'm rooting for them. It was more like, I can't believe all the stuff that's going down. Like what's going to happen next? It was good. It was very good. And finally, the last book on my list, but not number 10 by any means, it's probably one of my top of the year, is None of This Is True by Lisa Jewell. I recently read this, so it's like even more on my, like more recently on my mind than these other books I read this year. And loved this book. Absolutely love this book. It should have won, in my opinion, it should have won Mystery Thriller of 2023 on Goodreads. That's what it didn't. It was nominated, but it didn't win. Came in second place. So this is the story of two women, and I think they're in England, I want to say. And one of them has a podcast, and they are the same age, and they happen to cross paths on their 45th birthday. They're at the same restaurant celebrating their birthday at the same time. The one who has a podcast is married and has lots of friends and this big exciting life, and then the other one is there with her husband, her older husband, celebrating her birthday all alone, just the two of them. And the story there is she met her husband when she was 13 and he was in his 40s, so major ick there. But these two women, after crossing paths at the restaurant, they run into each other in the bathroom. The one who met her husband when she was 13, her name is Josie. She tells the lady who does the podcast, what's her name? The lady who does the podcast, her name is Alex. So Alex and Josie become kind of friends because Josie sells this idea to Alex of, hey, I should be the subject of your next podcast. My life is about to change, and I'd like to share my story with you and share my change with you. And this book is a mixed media book, and I actually listened to the audiobook and it was excellent. So there's the story, the story that's of happening of these two women meeting. There's her podcast, and then there's also this like Netflix murder mystery special happening too that comes in every once in a while, and it's telling the story of Josie and her husband and murder, and you don't know like who was murdered and who murdered who, like you don't know that part yet, but there's different parts of this Netflix documentary are popping in, and we know that someone is lying or multiple people are lying because of the title of the book. None of this is true, but you don't know what parts are true and what parts are lies, and you're trying to figure that out as you're reading the story. And of course Josie's life is crazy, and there's so many like twists at like towards the end, and yeah, loved it. It was such a good time. For those of us who like mystery thrillers, I mean, you have to read this book. It's so good as far as mystery thrillers go. I absolutely loved it. I think I might even read it again at some point because now that I know some things, I want to go back and I want to reread it. Okay guys, that is it for my top 10 books of 2023. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, will you please give it a thumbs up? And I'll see you again next time. Bye everyone.